When my stepmother told me I had 30 days to vacate the house I grew up in, she was wearing my late father's favorite sweater. That detail probably shouldn't have mattered. But it did. And it told me everything I needed to know about how the next few months were going to go. My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 29 years old, and I've been a licensed social worker for 4 years. I say that because it matters later. Because the woman who tried to destroy me made one critical miscalculation. She assumed that a woman who spends her days helping other people navigate broken systems wouldn't know how to protect herself inside one. My father died 11 months ago. His name was Thomas Dawson, and he was, genuinely, one of the best men I've ever known. He remarried when I was 12, after my mother passed from cancer. Her name was Diane. She came with 2 kids of her own, her son Marcus, who was 14, and her daughter Brooke, who was 10. My father loved all 3 of them. He made room for them in his heart the way he made room for everything quietly, completely, without keeping score. Diane never loved me. I want to be clear that I say that not out of bitterness, but out of accuracy. I am a social worker. I understand attachment patterns, family system dynamics, the slow architecture of resentment. Diane tolerated me the way you tolerate a leak in a ceiling you've decided not to fix. She worked around me. She made it known, in the way that leaves no fingerprints, that my presence in the house was a complication she hadn't signed up for. My father's family saw it. His brother, my Uncle Roy, saw it most clearly of all. Uncle Roy was not a soft man. He was 63 when he died, 8 months before my father, which is the kind of timing that breaks something in a family that never fully heals. He was a retired contracts attorney who had spent 35 years drafting the kind of language that makes grown men sit down at negotiating tables and go very quiet. He loved me the way my father loved me, without condition, without asterisk. He used to call me on Sunday mornings and ask me what I was reading, and when I told him, he'd tell me what he was reading, and we'd argue about it for an hour, and I'd hang up feeling like the luckiest person alive. He also watched Diane for 17 years. He told me once, over dinner at his kitchen table, that he had concerns, not accusations, concerns. He said, "Claire, your father is a good man who believes the best of people, and that is one of his great qualities, and one of his great vulnerabilities." He said it the way you say something you want someone to remember. I smiled, and told him he worried too much. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who had spent a career reading the fine print and said, "I hope you're right." He wasn't wrong. When Uncle Roy died, he left me a letter. It came through his attorney, a woman named Sandra Okafor, and it arrived 3 weeks after the funeral. The letter was short. It said that he loved me. It said that he hoped he was wrong about everything. And it said, if I was ever reading this under difficult circumstances, to call Sandra. He said she had something for me, but that I shouldn't call her until I needed to. He said I'd know when. I put Sandra's card in the back of a drawer and tried to believe I'd never need it. My father died 7 months after Uncle Roy. A massive stroke. No warning, no long goodbye. Here one morning and gone by afternoon. I was at work when my phone rang, and I drove to the hospital doing 60 in a 40 because some part of me knew before anyone said a word. I held his hand for the last 40 minutes of his life, and I talked to him about nothing in particular, about the book I was reading, about a client I'd helped that week, about the Sunday morning calls I was going to miss for the rest of my life. I don't know if he heard me. I choose to believe he did. Diane cried at the funeral. I want to be fair. She cried at the funeral, and the weeks after were quiet, and I thought I genuinely allowed myself to hope that perhaps grief had a way of smoothing rough edges. Marcus flew in from Denver. Brooke drove up from Charlotte. We sat in my father's living room together, and we were almost something that resembled a family. Then the will was read. My father had a house, the house I grew up in, paid off, worth about $380,000 in the current market. He had a retirement account, a modest investment portfolio, and a small business he'd run for 20 years. A landscaping company that employed 11 people and turned consistent profit. He had built all of it by hand. He had been proud of it in the way that quiet men are proud of things, without fanfare, just the steady satisfaction of work that meant something. The will left the house, and the business to me. Diane received the investment portfolio and the retirement account. Combined, that was close to $290,000. She was not left with nothing. She was not abandoned. She received a significant, specific inheritance that my father had clearly deliberated about. She received it, and then she decided it wasn't enough. I found out about the attorney when my cousin texted me to say that Diane had been asking around about inheritance challenges. I thought it was gossip. 1 week later, I received a certified letter. The letter was from an attorney named Gregory Holt, representing Diane Dawson and her children, Marcus and Brooke Connolly. It stated that Diane intended to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence. It stated that my relationship with my father had been manipulative in nature. It stated that as his spouse of 17 years, Diane had a legal claim to the marital home, and it stated that I had 30 days to respond. I read the letter twice. Then I went to my kitchen, made coffee, and sat for a long time in the particular silence that comes after something changes permanently. Then I opened my desk drawer and found Sandra Okafor's card. She answered on the second ring, which is not what I expected. I told her who I was. There was a brief pause and then she said, "I've been expecting your call. I've been hoping it would never come, but I've been expecting it." She asked me to come in the next morning. Sandra Okafor's office was in a building I'd driven past 100 times without ever entering. She was in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of calm that isn't detachment, it's discipline. She shook my hand and sat across from me and said, "Your uncle was one of the most thorough people I have ever worked with in 40 years of practicing law." And then she opened a file that was 3 inches thick. Uncle Roy had started the file 4 years ago. Not because he was vindictive, because he was a contracts attorney who understood that documentation is a form of love, and he had watched the woman in my father's house for 17 years, and he had made notes. He had kept emails. He had preserved voicemails. He had screenshots of text messages Diane had sent to Brooke about my father's finances, the house, the business, the retirement account. He had an affidavit from my father's accountant who had privately told Uncle Roy that Diane had twice attempted to add her name to business accounts without my father's knowledge. He had statements from 2 of my father's longtime employees who had witnessed Diane tell my father, on separate occasions, that the business would be better off in Marcus's hands. He had a record of the conversation my father had with him 18 months before he died, in which my father said he was concerned about Diane's intentions toward the estate, and that he wanted to update his will to protect me, and that he had done so with full legal counsel and full cognitive capacity, and that Uncle Roy had been present as an independent witness. He had, Sandra told me, prepared for this exact scenario. I sat in that chair, and I thought about all the Sunday morning phone calls, all the arguments about books, all the times I had told him he worried too much. Sandra slid a document across the desk. It was titled, in Uncle Roy's precise handwriting, "For Claire, to be used when necessary." Inside was a letter from my father, handwritten, dated 14 months before his death, notarized. It said that the decisions in his will were made without pressure, without coercion, and with full and clear intention. It said that he loved Diane and her children, and had tried to provide for them generously, and that he had made distinct choices about his business and his home, because those were the things he had built before their marriage, and he wanted them to remain with his blood. He said he hoped it never became complicated. He said he knew his brother, and if it did become complicated, Roy would have made sure I was protected. The letter ended, "Claire, you have never asked me for a single thing. Not once. I hope you know that was never a requirement. You were always enough exactly as you were. I love you, Dad. I will not pretend I was composed." Sandra had a box of tissues on her desk, and she did not make any show of not noticing when I needed them. When I was steady again, she explained the rest. The meeting Diane had requested through her attorney to discuss a settlement was scheduled for the following week. Diane's position was that she would withdraw the challenge if I agreed to sign the house over to her and allow Marcus to take operational control of the business. She framed it as a compromise. Sandra described it as a performance. She said, "They don't know what your uncle prepared. They're expecting you to come alone and feel outnumbered. They are expecting a 29-year-old woman with no legal background to fold under pressure." She closed the file and looked at me. "So we're not going to fold." The meeting was held at a conference space inside Diane's attorney's office, a converted Victorian near downtown that had been renovated into something that felt deliberately intimidating. All dark wood and high ceilings, and the kind of silence that is designed to make you feel small. I arrived at 10 in the morning, in the same blazer I wore to court when advocating for clients. I had learned a long time ago that the clothes you wear into difficult rooms are a form of preparation. Diane was already seated when I arrived. She looked the way she had always looked at difficult moments, composed, patient, with a particular expression that managed to be both sympathetic and satisfied. Marcus sat to her left, his arms crossed, wearing a jacket that still had the tag crease in the sleeve. Brooke sat to her right, scrolling through her phone until Gregory Holt told her quietly to put it away. Holt himself was a broad man in his mid-40s, with the bearing of someone who had been told many times that he was intimidating. "Claire." Diane used my name like a greeting and a rebuke simultaneously. "Thank you for coming." I sat down without responding. Holt opened a folder. He explained, in the measured language of a man billing by the hour, that his client had experienced significant emotional and financial hardship following the loss of her husband of 17 years. He said that the will, while technically valid, reflected decisions made under the influence of a daughter who had been present during her father's final years, while Diane had been managing household responsibilities and caregiving. He used the word caregiving with particular emphasis, and I noticed Diane straighten slightly when he said it. "My father did not require caregiving," I said. "He was healthy until the day he died." Holt smiled in the way that men smile when they intend the smile to end a conversation. "Be that as it may, a spouse of 17 years has both moral and legal standing to request equitable distribution of marital assets, including the family home." "The family home," I said. "I want to make sure I understand." "The home my father purchased in 1997, 11 years before he met Diane, is the family home." Marcus leaned forward. "You lived in that house for 22 years. My mom spent 17 of those years running it." "Running it," I repeated. "I want to ask you something, Marcus. When the dishwasher broke in 2019, who called the repair company? When the roof needed replacing, who researched contractors and managed the project? When my father came home from work every night, who had dinner ready? Because if the answer is my father, working 6 days a week at a business he built from zero, then I think we have different definitions of running a household." He opened his mouth. Holt put a hand on his arm. "Claire," Diane said, and her voice had shifted slightly, become warmer in a way that was not warmth. "I understand you're grieving, we all are, but I gave 17 years to this family. I raised you alongside my own children." I looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then I said, "You raised me." I'd like to ask Brooke if that's the word she would use. Brooke looked up from her phone. "I'm sorry," I said directly to her. "I know this isn't comfortable, but your mother told me, on my 18th birthday, that now that I was legally an adult, she was no longer responsible for me. She said it in the kitchen while my dad was at work. She said she had fulfilled her obligation. I was 18 years old. I remember it very clearly." "Would you describe that as raising someone?" Brooke looked at her mother. Something passed between them that I wasn't meant to see. "This is not the purpose of this meeting," Holt said smoothly. "You're right," I said. "The purpose of this meeting, as I understand it, is for you to present an offer. So let's hear it." He presented it. The house, transferred to Diane. The business, transferred operationally to Marcus with a revenue share for me of 15% for the first 3 years, after which my involvement would terminate. In exchange, Diane would drop the will contest. I let him finish. Then I said, Can you give me 60 seconds? Holt glanced at Diane. She nodded with the gracious expression of someone who believes they've already won. I stepped into the hallway and called Sandra. She answered immediately. I said, "They've made the offer." She said, "Exactly as we expected?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Perfect. Come back in and tell them you'd like your attorney present before you make any decisions. Then sit down and wait." I'm pulling in now. I walked back into the conference room and took my seat. Diane was checking her own phone. Marcus was muttering something to Brooke. Holt was making notes in a margin. "I've decided I'd like my attorney present before I respond," I said. Diane looked up. "Your attorney? I've had one since 2 weeks after Uncle Roy died. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that sooner." The door opened 4 minutes later. Sandra walked in carrying a leather portfolio that I had come to understand contained the careful architecture of everything my uncle had spent 4 years building. She introduced herself. Holt looked at her the way attorneys look at other attorneys when they are recalibrating a situation they thought they had mapped. Sandra sat beside me, opened the portfolio, and said, "Before we discuss any offers, I'd like to share some documentation relevant to this proceeding." Holt said, "We're here to negotiate, not to." "I'm aware of why we're here," Sandra said pleasantly. "This will take approximately 15 minutes. You can bill for them." She started with the accountant's affidavit, the one documenting the 2 attempts to access my father's business accounts. Diane's face did not move, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of tell you only notice if you've spent years watching people try to hold expressions in place. Then came the employee statements. Then the text messages to Brooke about the estate, the ones where Diane had written, "If your father plays this right, we should be able to get the business in Marcus's name within 2 years of Thomas going." Brooke made a short, involuntary sound. Marcus turned to look at his sister. Sandra kept her voice perfectly even. Then she placed my father's handwritten letter on the table. Diane read the first 2 lines and pushed back from the table. "Where did you get that?" she said. Her voice was different now, smaller. "Your brother-in-law," Sandra said. "Roy Dawson spent 4 years preparing this documentation because he loved his niece and he knew his brother, and he understood that the people in this room might one day try to do exactly what you are attempting to do today." "That is fabricated," Holt said, though his voice had lost its boardroom quality. Sandra slid across a certificate of authentication from a document examiner. Then she slid across the notarization record. Then she slid across a video file on a tablet. Uncle Roy, sitting at a desk in what I recognized as Sandra's office, reading the letter aloud and confirming that he had been present when my father wrote it, and that my father had been of sound mind, and that the decisions in the will were deliberate and fully informed. Diane was staring at the tablet with an expression I had never seen on her face before. The composed patience was completely gone. What was underneath it was something rawer and harder to look at. Not guilt, exactly, but the expression of someone who has miscalculated badly and knows it. Marcus stood up. He looked at his mother and then at me, and the thing I will remember is that he couldn't hold eye contact. He looked away first. Sandra folded her hands on the table. "Now, I'd like to discuss your actual options." She explained them the way Uncle Roy would have precisely, without malice, without theater. Option 1. Diane withdrew the contest, signed a formal acknowledgement that the will reflected my father's genuine intentions, and received no further legal action from me regarding the account access attempts. Option 2. The documentation went to the probate court, to the state bar for review of Holt's conduct in pursuing a contest he'd been provided no legitimate grounds for, and to my father's business partners, who had a right to know that someone had attempted to access accounts without authorization. Holt's hand had stopped moving across the page. "Take as long as you need," Sandra said. "But I should mention that the probate filing can be initiated from my phone. Preparation tends to make these things efficient." Diane sat for a long time. The room was so quiet I could hear traffic from outside, the ordinary sound of a city that didn't know or care what was being decided in this room. Then she picked up the pen. She signed everything slowly, in the way that people sign things when they are trying to preserve dignity they have already lost. Holt signed the withdrawal. Marcus signed his name where required and didn't look at me. Brooke had stopped scrolling her phone entirely. She was looking at her hands. When it was done, Sandra collected the documents and stood. She thanked Holt with the precise neutrality of a professional. She nodded to Diane. Then she said to me, quietly, "Are you ready?" I looked at Diane one last time. For a moment I genuinely tried to find something to say. Something that was true and not cruel. I thought about 17 years of being tolerated, of being managed, of being made to feel like a footnote in a story I had actually started. I said, "I hope you find some peace. I mean that." She didn't respond. I didn't expect her to. Sandra and I walked out into a morning that was cold and bright, in the way that October in the Carolinas is sometimes unexpectedly beautiful, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. There are things that happened in the weeks after that I did not anticipate. I had expected the relief. I had not expected how much the relief would ache. Marcus called me 3 weeks later. He said, "I want you to know I didn't realize how far Mom had gone with the planning." I said, "I know." He said, "That doesn't make it right that I went along with it." I said, "No, it doesn't." He asked if there was anything he could say. I told him I didn't have an answer yet. I told him I might have one eventually. That's the honest truth, I might. I haven't decided. Some doors, once opened, take time to figure out whether you want to walk through them or close them for good. Brooke sent me a text message that was 3 lines long. It said, "I'm sorry about the texts Mom sent me. I knew they weren't right, and I didn't say anything. I'm really sorry about your dad." I replied, "Thank you." And I meant it. She was 10 years old when she came into my house. None of this started with her. The extended family, my father's cousins, his old friends from the neighborhood, reached out the way extended families do, in waves, some genuine, some curious, a few transparently interested in details I had no intention of providing. I was kind to the genuine ones. I ignored the rest. The business took most of my attention for the following 2 months. My father's employees had been anxious through the whole ordeal, 11 people whose livelihoods were attached to uncertainty, and they deserved to know they were stable. I met with each of them individually. The operations manager, a man named Darnell, who had worked for my father for 16 years, took one look at me in the first meeting and said, "You have his eyes, you know. You make decisions the same way he did." I did not manage to get through that conversation without crying, but I got through it. I kept the house. I want to be clear about that because people have asked. I kept it not because I needed the money from selling it and not because I was making a point. I kept it because my father built it from the ground up when he was 27 years old, and because there is a magnolia tree in the backyard that he planted the year I was born, and because when I walk into the kitchen in the morning, I can still, sometimes, if I'm not thinking too hard, feel the shape of the life that used to be there. I had one framed thing made for my desk. It's a copy of the letter my father wrote. Not the whole thing, just the last 2 sentences. The ones that said what he'd spent my whole life showing me in 1,000 small ways but had never, until that letter, said aloud. Sandra told me later that it had been Uncle Roy's idea to hold the documentation until the last possible moment. He had told her, in the meeting where they finalized everything, that the documentation would mean more, would be more legally powerful, and more personally meaningful if it was deployed in the moment of confrontation, rather than preemptively. He had said, "Claire needs to see that she can walk into the room. She needs to know she did that herself. Give her the tools, but let her use them." That sounds exactly like him. It sounds like Sunday mornings and arguments about books and the specific kind of love that prepares you for things instead of protecting you from them. I go to the cemetery on Sunday mornings now. Both of them, my father's grave and Uncle Roy's, which are in the same section about 50 feet apart, which is either a coincidence or so perfectly characteristic of both of them that it barely counts as one. I bring coffee, 2 cups I never drink, and I talk. I tell them what I'm reading. I tell them how the business is doing. I told them, last week, that we hired 2 new crew members, and that Darnell finally agreed to take the operations director title he'd been doing the work for without the title for 3 years. I told them about the magnolia tree, which bloomed early this year, enormous and extravagant, and entirely unbothered by everything that had happened in the house behind it. I told them I was okay. Setting limits with people who have made you feel small for years is not an event. It doesn't end when you walk out of a conference room. It's a practice, the slow daily work of choosing, over and over, not to make yourself smaller in order to make other people comfortable. I am still learning this. I think I will be learning it for a long time. But I know this. I walked into that room. I sat in that chair. I said, clearly and without apology, this is what is true, and this is what belongs to me, and I am not leaving without it. And then I went home to my father's house, and I made coffee in his kitchen, and I opened a book, and outside the window, the magnolia tree stood in the yard like it had always stood there, rooted and unhurried, belonging exactly where it was. If you've ever had to defend what is rightfully yours from the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know that what you feel is not bitterness. It is not ingratitude. It is the entirely reasonable response to having been treated like a footnote in a story you were actually the center of all along. You were not too much. You were not a burden. You were not lucky to be tolerated. You were always enough. Don't let anyone make you forget it.